Okay. Hi, everyone. This is truly an honor to be invited by Raquel and Claudio and Lacea in general to introduce Lise Vesterlund to this keynote. It's a true honor because he's a person that I admire immensely, that I have known for many years. Um, of course, because of our common interest in using behavioral and experimental economics, I have been attending conferences and shared spaces with her. But I want to make this introduction um, with the aim to open to a community like Lacea to the work of one of the persons that has been most productive and make immense contributions over years and years of her work, being a pioneer in using experimental economics in important, very relevant questions that we need to address in the profession. But not only because of the academical purposes of these questions, but also the applications and the relevance of them. The title of her talk is Gendered Work Assignments, Cause and Effect. But I wanted to just quickly, through this intervention, this introduction, highlight couple things that I think are highly relevant of her work and her career. Lise earned her bachelor's in economics from the University of Copenhagen and then did her PhD at Wisconsin-Madison. And she has been working on several issues, many of them related to gender. Not only on that, I'm not going to start reading the resume because it would take a lot of time. But I think that what I want to address here is the following, that when you look at her work in terms of academic production, we're talking about really relevant and important questions, but also being able to publish them in major journals. And I'm going to mention just 4 or 5 examples of work in gender and altruism with Jim Andreoni. This is a highly cited paper with very important issues back 20 years back. This is 2001, if I remember correctly, on the idea of gender differences in prosociality, in how altruism is represented in actions by men and women. Also another QJE paper a few years later with Muriel Niederle on competition and gender. This is another relevant issue, and probably Lisa is going to mention this today. You should take a look at this Journal of Economic Perspectives piece on getting into the details of why the gender gap has to do with how men and female perform and choose tasks that are related to cognitive skills, in particular math. And I am highlighting this in particular because of the relevance that it has regarding the role of women in a profession like economics and the role of math in filtering or rewarding men and women in the profession. And this is something that I want to say in a second. There's a recently published JPE paper on the issue of asking and negotiating, with very interesting issues that she might mention or not, in which we have to be careful about this conjecture that the problem is that women don't know how to negotiate. I think this paper is key into those questions on negotiation and gender, but also outside of the lab. And I wanted to highlight this recent paper that she is sharing very recently. This is from June this year, in which she looks at data outside of the lab, data in negotiations in the real estate transactions. And this is, I wanted to highlight this because Lisa has been working also outside of the lab of the very same questions, trying to get into the issues of how men and women perform, interact, and then realize the results of their negotiations, actions, competition, and the like. But even more important, she is a person that cares deeply about these issues, and she wants to translate her scholarship into action, her scholarship into inspiring people, into helping people around her, and becoming a role model in general and in particular for women. And this has involved also, she might mention this because it's going to become a book soon, we hope, in what she has been working on for a few years now, in what she calls the I Just Can't Say No Club, and why women need to find ways to progress in their careers by dealing with these issues of saying no at the right time and at the right task, at the wrong task in this case, and being able to walk in their careers in better ways, so that the progress in terms of their academic careers or professional careers in different organizations. And this is something that she has been doing in this idea of this club, in which she and others try to help other women in particular to learn how to find the right tasks and accept the right tasks to progress in their careers. And this I know from personal experience, from friends in common, and even from children of friends in common that have heard her talks and get highly inspired by this idea that women need to learn how to progress in their careers by saying yes to the right tasks and no to the wrong tasks. I want to say this because in the Latin American context, the economics profession has a huge challenge in terms of opening the space and create better gender balance. I personally think that the Latin American crowd in economics needs to make more progress. The data says so, that we have a serious problem of imbalance, and it has to do in terms of applications of high school students into economics bachelor's programs, moving on into grad school, and then choosing an academic career in economics, and finally in the job market in economics in Latin American schools. And I think this would be a great audience to think about what Lise is going to share with us with her ideas and her experience and her research. So thank you, Lise, for coming to Lacea. It's a great honor to present what you have been doing, and thanks to Lacea to inviting me to say how much I admire your work and how much I admire what you have done for the profession and for the different issues where you have worked. So the floor is yours, Lise. We will be getting the questions through the Q&A and the chat rooms. I will be collecting them, and only at the end, when she finishes, we will open to those questions for her to answer. So go ahead, Lise.
Ended up muting myself. Thank you so much, Juan Camilo. That was incredibly generous, but I really appreciate your introductory remarks. It's very sweet of you. I think we just saw one another in Bogota in January. So it's the world has changed quite a bit since we had conferences in person, but it is really, really nice to be here. I'm so grateful to have gotten the invitation. I wish that we were all spending time in Miami instead of, I mean, Pittsburgh is lovely this time of year, trust me. But regrettably, this is what we're gonna have to put up with. So I do hope that you will send lots of questions in the chat. I understand that I'm supposed to just talk, but I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end so that you can, we can hopefully get some back and forth with questions. So what I'm going to talk about today is sort of very closely related, sort of trying to give an overview of the work that I've done, but also of the sort of really tying it in on this issue of gendered task assignment. And the reason why I've spent a lot of time working in this area of gender and how they differ in their outcomes and behavior in the labor market is that we continue to see very large differences between men and women. And we're seeing that despite the fact that we've seen, it used to be that we would say the reason why men are making more money, the reason why they're advancing faster is because they are better educated, they have, more years of experience in the labor market, et cetera, et cetera. What's challenging now is that those differences are really decreasing very significantly. So, this is a graph from Marianne Bertrand's paper on the glass ceiling, but it's the same everywhere. Women are really going to college at much larger rates than they used to, and they're now securing more education than men. Despite those differences, we continue to see both differences in compensation with women making less money than men, and also in terms of both the horizontal segregation with men and women selecting different occupations, but in particular in terms of sort of the vertical segregation with women advancing at lower rates than men. And where that becomes particularly relevant, of course, the measure that we usually look at is, how likely are women to be in sort of the most powerful positions in an organization? So what is the representation on boards? How likely are we to see female CEOs? And I must admit that I had not looked up the numbers for Latin America and the Caribbean countries, but as you can see, the representation is poor across the board. Women account for about 20% of board membership, and around 6% of CEOs in large companies are females. Latin America is not doing better on those numbers. For a long time, I kept thinking, well, since I grew up in Denmark, surely the numbers in Denmark would be better, because in Denmark, we're all raised to think that we had equal opportunities. We could all have an equal shot at making it to the top. It turns out that the numbers are exactly the same in Denmark. So it's about 20% of board members that are female and about 6% who are CEOs. So it's not as if Denmark is doing any better. Women are not making it to the top. But of course we could say, well, maybe they get close to the top. One way of sort of summarizing what we call the glass ceiling or women's inability to make it to the top is just to look at the wage distributions. And that's precisely what Marianne Bertrand does in her paper, where she compares college-educated employees working full-time all year long in the same occupation. And it gives you a sense of how distorted this is. So we're not looking at people who are working part-time, we're looking at similar men and women. And what she's finding is that only 34% of the women are earning above the median of the men, right? So obviously there are 50% of men who are in that category. And if you look at the top 20%, it's only 10% of women who are in that set. And of course, if you move further up, the sample gets smaller, but of course the representation of women gets smaller and smaller. So women are just, they're not making it to the top, both in terms of positions of power, but also in terms of salary compensation. Now, there are, of course, many reasons why this could be happening. And indeed, we've been concerned about these differences for a long time. And if you look at any corporation in the US, they've undertaken lots of different initiatives to try to get around this. So many companies have diversity officers who are supposed to improve on these things. We changed the way that we negotiate. We might put in a salary history ban. We might not make it possible that we can ask about salary histories, et cetera, et cetera. So there are lots of initiatives to try to improve these differences in labor market outcomes. Unfortunately, it looks like we've sort of reached a plateau, and there's all these initiatives are really not moving the needle much. What I'm going to try to argue in the talk today is that I think some of these initiatives have failed because we haven't taken into the account that there's an underlying structural problem in the way that we assign tasks to men and women. So we've sort of been focusing on the outcomes, and we keep saying the outcomes should be the same, but we haven't dealt with the fact that the work that we give men and women to do on a day-to-day basis seems to differ in promotability of advancing later on. And unless we start addressing the way that we allocate these tasks, it's going to be very hard to make advancements on these labor market outcomes that we're concerned about. What do I mean by these task assignments? So what we've found in our work is that the work that men and women are given tends to differ along the dimension that we call promotability. And what we mean by promotability is the extent to which your performance on the task is going to influence your evaluation and promotion in the future. So if you think about academia, what is the promotable task? We can all agree that doing research is very promotable. If you look at industry positions, what are the promotable tasks? Promotable tasks are tasks that bring in a lot of revenue for the firm. So if you're given non-revenue generating work, it's going to be much harder for you to advance. So that's the dimension that we think about in terms of promotability. And indeed, you could say, well, is there agreement on what is promotable? Well, you will not be surprised to see that indeed in academia, there's a lot of agreement on what is promotable. So we ran a simple survey of faculty where we said, imagine you have an assistant professor. The professor has an additional 50 hours to spend over the semester. How should the assistant professor spend his or her time to increase the chance of getting promoted, working on a research paper, going to a conference, serving on an undergraduate curriculum revision committee, or serving on faculty senate? And there will be no surprises here. People agree that working on research is going to get you promoted. If anything, it's surprising that 8% of these faculty members who were surveyed didn't think that this was where the most important work was, but there's no disagreement on what is promotable work. And we've seen that in talking to companies as well, that indeed people understand what the promotable work is. So we see agreement on the promotability. And indeed, when we go to look at the research that has been done, not necessarily calling it promotability, but the research that has been done looking at the tasks that male and female employees are getting both in academia and in industry, there's a very systematic pattern that shows that women are given more tasks or spending more time on tasks that don't lead to the same advancement. So in academia, we see women having less time for research, spending more time advising undergraduate students. They serve on more committees. And of course, these jobs are very important. So it's not to say we should all stop serving on committees and working with undergraduates, but you could imagine why it's hard for a female faculty member to advance at the same rate as a male faculty member if she's spending a lot more time doing the things that don't matter for promotion. So we're seeing this across the board. In fact, we worked with a service firm where one of the benefits of service firms is that they keep very meticulous accounts of the hours that people are spending for billing purposes. And you can look based on the code for each hour that's spent, how that time was spent. And what we did was that we asked the firm's leadership to sit down, look at the tasks, and evaluate them on sort of the promotability continuum. Is this, if you are mentoring somebody, how likely is it that you would get promoted on that? So they sorted all these different tasks. And what we see when we look at junior hires in this firm and say, look at the differences between men and women, what we see is that women, so this is the difference in median annual hours spent on the tasks, where the difference is between women and men. So you can see that women spend about 200 hours more per year on non-promotable work, and men spend about 250 hours more on promotable work. Now, if you have task differences along these dimensions, you're taking 5 solid weeks of work where people are doing the thing that does or does not get you advanced. We're seeing across the board that there are these differences in task allocations. Now, the question, of course, is why are we seeing those differences? There are many, many reasons why we could see men and women doing different work and getting different assignments. They could be that there are certain tasks that women prefer to do. Maybe they prefer to do the less promotable work. There could be differences in ability. If women are not good at doing the promotable work, then from the firm's perspective, they should not be doing the promotable work. There could be issues of discrimination. It could be that we don't think that they can do it, but they actually could be doing it. What I'm going to focus on is the work that I've done that relates, not to ignore the three initial explanations because I think they're very real, but rather to say there are also behavioral differences in the way that we respond to these tasks. In particular, if you sort of go back to thinking about this promotability spectrum, if you come into the office meeting and there's a very, very attractive client that's going to be distributed at this meeting, the client is new, very prestigious, brings in lots of revenue. You could imagine the way that you're going to secure that client as somebody you're working for. It's going to be a very competitive process. And indeed, in my work, as Juan Camilo was mentioning, in my work with Muriel Niederlieb, we have been finding very systematic differences in the way that males and females respond to the decision on going into a competition, which could certainly affect the likelihood that you're going to fight for this attractive client. And what we did in that setting, you know, of course, economists are not the first to say that there could be gender differences in competition. Psychologists have been saying this for a long time, where they point out that little boys like to do more competitive games. Men seem to, be more excited about sports, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an inherent difference in competition. And the reason why we went into the lab was that we wanted to see, if I'm looking at a scenario where I can control for performance, it may be that boys play football because they're better at playing football. I wanted to take it to the laboratory so that I could look at what is the actual performance. And the scenario we set up was just that we made these mixed gender groups with 2 men and 2 women, and they were asked to solve cross sums for 5 minutes. And they were paid based on how many cross sums they served. In one task, they were first introduced to what we called a piece rate, where for every problem you solved, you got 50 cents. Then after they had solved the piece rate, we said, now you're going to be in a tournament where you're competing against the 3 other people in your group. And the person who solves the most problems correctly will get $2 per problem, so 4 times more. So they go through that. It turns out that men and women, when they do the piece rate in the tournament, they're equally good at adding up 5 2-digit numbers. So there are no differences in performance whatsoever on the first 2 tasks. Women are just as good at performing under this competitive pressure. Then after they've completed that, without getting feedback on whether or not they won the competition, we say, okay, you get to perform 1 more time. Now you should decide if you want that to be under the piece rate where you get 50 cents no matter how you do, or if you want it to be under the tournament where if you outperform the 3 other members in the initial tournament that they're in, you will get $2 per problem that you solved. Now, because we see no differences in performance, what we're predicting is that when they're making the choice, that we should see men and women being equally likely to select a tournament and equally likely to select the piece rate. What we see instead is that women are much less likely to enter the tournament. Okay, so only about 1/3 of the women go into the tournament, about 75% of the men go into the tournament. We get this very, very large gap in willingness to go into the tournament. And what is sort of from an economic perspective very disturbing is that we see very high performing women not going into the competition. So the highest performing women are not going into the competitions that they could win. In fact, it turns out the highest performing women enter competitions less than the worst performing men. Right? So from an economic perspective, that's very concerning. We want the best people to be making it to the top. Now, what is driving that difference is we say, tell us, how do you think you rated relative to the three other people in the group? Do you think you were the best, the second best, the third best, the fourth best? Now, of course, given that we have no differences in performance, we should see 25% of males saying first, second, third, and fourth, and the same should happen for women. What we see instead is that men are what we would call overconfident. So 75% of the men in our sample say that they think that they were best. So of course, if men think that they're best, they should be going into the competition. So a large reason why we see this very large difference in tournament entry is because men are overconfident. Now, it's not the case that women are underconfident. They too should say that 25% think that they're first, but they're not as overconfident as the men. So this gender difference in beliefs seem to be driving the tournament entry. Now, that is not the only thing that's driving the difference in tournament entry, because when I look at among the people who said, I think I'm best, I think I'm second best, third best, and fourth best, we can see that there is about a 30 percentage point gap between, for the women and men who thought that they were best, we can see that there is, even conditional on your belief, women are less likely to go in. So it seems like there are two things that drive this gender gap in competition. One is this difference in confidence, and another is competitiveness or willingness to go into this competition. Now, fortunately, this is a result that has been replicated all over the world, which has been very exciting. There are few places it has not been replicated. One of the places is among in a matrilineal society in India, but by and large, well, you do this in Europe, the US, lots of places, Africa, these differences have been showing up. And what's intriguing about this gender gap in competition is that it's actually predictive of both your future sort of field of study and future income. So it definitely is capturing some fundamental traits. Now, what this study would suggest is that when we're looking at allocating these sort of very attractive tasks, we would expect men to get a larger share of them, right? So if they're more competitive, they're more confident about their ability to sort of pull this off, they're going to be the ones putting their names in to get the client. Now, you could imagine that if I then look at the low promotable task, that's just going to be the residual. The competition of the men is driving everything. There's nothing else going on. But in thinking about the less promotable work, in my work with Linda Babcock, Laura Weingart, and Maria Recalde, we wondered if that's all that's going on. Part of what we're doing in this setting is just to say, if there's a less attractive task that has to be assigned, you come into the office, you're presented with a client that has been with the firm forever, very limited revenue, very limited upward mobility, who's going to take the task? Now, in that case, there's not going to be a lot of competitions. Rather, people are going to be looking for a volunteer to take one for the team. And what we wanted to figure out is when we're looking for these volunteers, who's the person who steps up to take the task? And we sort of started off by getting some wonderful field data. As you will recall, our initial survey showed that serving on faculty senate was viewed as not being good for advancement. And we got data from a large university where all the faculty had been sent an email asking them to volunteer for a faculty senate committee. So we're looking at how willing are people to sign up for this faculty senate position that will not advance their career. Now, if you're wondering, faculty senate is an important institution at the university. It's not something that really gets you the bump when it comes time to promotion. If you're wondering how eager people are to take on this task, the responses from faculty was that a substantial 3.7% of faculty said, sure, I'll do that. Okay, so this is not something that faculty are jumping in to do. What's disturbing is that only 2.6% of men said that they would take on the task. Now, why is that disturbing? Well, number one, it's less than 3.7%, but there are many more men. There are many more male faculty members. And in fact, when we look at the female faculty, 7% of the female faculty say yes. And indeed, the gaps are the largest when we look at assistant professors. So assistant professors who should be most concerned about doing research and getting promoted end up ultimately in being overrepresented on the faculty senate. So women in general end up being overrepresented on the faculty senate, and assistant professors who are female are particularly overrepresented. Okay, so we're seeing in sort of this control setting where we know precisely what was the request that went out and how did they respond, we see women volunteering more. Now, of course, this doesn't rule out the possibility that this is just because women really like to be on faculty senate. So what we wanted to do instead was to say, let's take this into the laboratory, where this is not a question where somebody can't come back and say, or the reason why women volunteer is that they like to spend their evenings with their colleagues instead of with their families. So let's take this to the laboratory. And part of what we had in mind for the laboratory is a setting that often happens at the University of Pittsburgh. So when we have, say, a promotion and tenure meeting at the University of Pittsburgh, we often start the meeting by asking for someone to chair the committee. Chairing the committee just means that you get stuck writing a report afterwards. So nobody wants to chair the committee. And what we wanted to set up in the lab is a setting that's similar to that, where everybody's just sitting and waiting for somebody to just please say, yes, I will write the report afterwards, even though everybody knows that this is not going to help them. So if you think about this meeting where you have to allocate this task that nobody wants, you can see that, the dean is also present at this meeting. If nobody volunteers, the dean is going to get very upset. So that's a bad outcome. So if nobody's volunteering, I will definitely volunteer because it's going to help me out. Now, I would be much better off if somebody else would just volunteer. So the setting we set up is one where we have groups of 3 come in. We form new groups over 10 rounds, but there are 3 people in the group in any given scenario. And they have 2 minutes during which they can decide to click a button. If nobody clicks that button, everybody gets $1. But if you click the button, you get $1.25. So you're going to be better off if nobody clicks the button by just clicking the button and getting the dean to be happy. However, the people who didn't click the button when you click will get $2. So everyone is going to be better off if someone will just click the button. It's just that you would rather have someone else click the button. So this is the scenario they're in. They do this for 10 rounds. And what we see in terms of gender differences, well, number one, they understand that it's a good idea to click the button. About 80% of people, 80% of the group succeed in finding somebody to click the button. But what we see, so this is the payoffs, just so that you can remind yourself. So if nobody clicks, everybody gets $1. If you click and nobody else does, you get $1.25 and everybody else gets $2. But you would just much rather have somebody else click so that you can get the $2. Okay, so that's the scenario that they're playing. As you can imagine, people wait to the very end of the 2 minutes before they click. Okay, so they're waiting to see if somebody else will click before they jump in to volunteer. Now, what do we see in terms of the gender gap? This is the gender gap we see. So from the very beginning of this game, women are volunteering more than men. So women volunteer about 33% of the time, men is around 20% of the time. And what we have on the horizontal axis is the rounds that they're doing it. So remember, they're doing it over 10 rounds. And as you can see, it's not like men get to the very end and say, oh, maybe I should try to click the button and volunteer. They stick to this throughout. And indeed, we can sort of say, what is driving this difference? It could be a number of different things. Once again, it could just be that women are more concerned about the groups. That women are just, they like the group, they want everybody to feel well, and men just don't have that feeling. Now, how are we gonna try to disentangle that? We try to do a lot of survey measures, et cetera, but an easy way to sort of directly test what is driving this difference is to say, imagine instead of having this mixed gender group where I both have men and women, that instead I'm just going to have the women. Now, if I have an all-female group and all the women are just more concerned about the collective, we should see women have a higher overall success rate. And similarly, if I take all men and they're not concerned about the collective, they should have a lower overall success rate. Right? So if it's driven by somehow that men and women have different preferences, I can control for that by looking at these all male and female groups. Okay, so that's what we decided to do next to see what is driving this difference. So instead of having my mixed gender setting, I have, they just show up to the lab. It just so happens that only men showed up to the lab. Or it just so happened that only females showed up to the lab. And what we wanted to do was precisely what I said before. We wanted to see, is this coming just from the fact that men and women might have different preferences? What we're seeing as the alternative is instead what seems to be driving this is not preferences, but rather that when we're in mixed gender groups, we're playing a coordination game, and the solution to that coordination game will often be that the person who takes one for the team is the female. Now, if that's the if we have those beliefs, what's going to happen is the men are going to sit back, and the women knows that it's in their interest to click the button because the men are not going to do that. Now I can perturb those beliefs by going into an all-female group, because if I go into an all-female group, the women look around and they say, oh, the other women showed up. I don't have to click as much as I otherwise would. And similarly, if I take an all-male group and they come into the lab, they look around, they say there are no females there. If it's driven by beliefs, we should see the men step up to the task. And that, let's look at what happens. So the overall success rate, as I said before, when we have mixed sex settings, is that we see investments about 80% of the time. If instead I have an all-female session, remember, if it's driven by women being more generously inclined, we should see a higher success rate in the all-female group because the men are not there. What we see instead is that the all-female group is identical to the mixed gender group. So they seem to respond to the absence of men by not volunteering as much. What about the single men? Do they somehow not click the button? What we see is the exact same pattern. Men click the button, but only when the women are not present, okay? So this sort of points to belief. Sorry, I swear it's not contagious. But another way to look at beliefs is to say, what if we had a manager come in and the manager got to sort of look at the three people in the group and decide, who am I going to ask? Now, if the manager expects women to be more likely to say yes, they're going to ask the women more. So we modified the game. It's the exact same game that we had before. It's just before we get to this round with three people deciding to click, the manager gets to send a message to one person to say, please click the button, and everybody else gets to see who was asked to click the button. So in this case, you see the actual images of the people in your group, and the manager gets to decide who to ask. And as you can imagine, who you ask is going to vary a lot. You know, there are some people who look super friendly. There's some who don't look so friendly. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. What we're interested in is who is asked a lot and is gender predictive of who is asked a lot. And if we look at the total, in some sense, you could sort of say, you know, is it really a good idea to ask the women if they're being asked over and over these 10 rounds? Are they going to keep doing it? Well, so let's look at the total number of requests that are going to the men and the females. So this is done by strategy method, so you can get more requests than 10 requests. And what you can see is that while there's lots of heterogeneity, there are some people who are only asked once out of the many sets of times that you can be asked. You can see that the distribution of requests going to women, well, despite the heterogeneity, there are many, many more requests going to women. Now, in order for this to be sort of a belief confirming story, it shouldn't just be that we see the manager asking women more. In fact, it turns out that it doesn't matter what the gender of the manager is. Both male and female managers will ask women more. But is it a good idea to ask women over and over and over? Can that possibly be the optimal strategy? Well, it turns out it's much better to ask the women, because despite the fact that they're asked more, they say yes 75% of the time, whereas men only say yes 50-50. Okay, so we see this very systematic pattern where beliefs seem to be driving the difference in volunteering rather than preferences. So I should also mention this has already been replicated both by Catherine Eckel at Texas A&M. Another group in India have replicated it, and we just got results from Norway, and we get the exact same results. So while this is a newer study, the magnitudes of the effect are surprisingly stable across these environments. Okay, so if we sort of go back to thinking about what could be causing this gender task allocation, well, it's not just the fact that men are more competitive and more overconfident. It also seems like part of the reason why we end up with different tasks is that women on their own are more likely to volunteer because they're expected to volunteer, but they're also more likely to be asked directly. And when they're asked directly, they're more likely to say yes. Okay, so both of these channels can give rise to these gender task allocations. Now, you sort of say, okay, well, what does this matter? Well, where it matters is that if men and women in the day-to-day work that they get are doing different tasks, those differences would generate a lot of the patterns that we're seeing in labor market outcomes. It can, of course, explain why women are advancing at lower rates than men. It can explain why women select into different occupations than men. It can explain why they, depending on field, in particular in male-dominated fields, or if we look at engineers, job satisfaction is very limited and they have greater turnover. Certainly, if you end up with the less revenue-generating client, you can imagine why it should also impact the compensation that you get, and also could impact your ability to negotiate. And it's exactly these two last things that in a recent study that we have been looking at. So what we're going to do next, so I sort of talked to you about what is causing the gender task allocation. What I'm going to do next is to talk about how can that gender task allocation spill over into both the compensation that you're going to get for the work that you do, but also into your ability to negotiate conditional on those tasks. So of course, the literature on, when talking about compensation and negotiation, that's obviously a very large literature where we've found significant differences between men and women, in particular on the extensive margin, meaning whether or not women go into a competition. There's the most famous study by far is the study by Babcock and Lacea, where they asked graduates from Carnegie Mellon whether or not they negotiated their first salary when they entered the job market, where they found that only 7% of women negotiated their first salary, whereas 57% of men negotiated the first salary. Given that the negotiation is successful, you could imagine that that's going to lead to a very significant gender wage gap in the future. Now, so that's on the extensive margin where we find differences. On the intensive margin, that is the extent to which men and women differ in their ability to negotiate, the results really differ depending on the environment in which you're negotiating in. And what's particularly interesting for this talk is that the characteristics of negotiations where women will do less well are precisely those that are around the labor market negotiations. So women tend to do worse if they're negotiating on behalf of themselves, if they are uncertain about what is negotiable, and if it's a competitive setting where there are other people who are trying to get part of the pie. So certainly we would expect both on the extensive and the intensive margin that women do worse in the negotiation. And indeed, the field evidence all points to precisely that, with women both sort of opting out of environments where they can negotiate, women who are less willing to negotiate advance at a lower rate. The study by Librand and List was a field experiment where they posted jobs online, where they saw that men are more likely to apply for jobs where it's uncertain whether or not the negotiation is whether or not the wage is negotiable. So they sort of point out that there's both a willingness and ability to negotiate, but also sort of the sorting effect. The sorting effect, along with the ability to negotiate, is also found in the Card, Cardoza, and Klein study. And then Seve Soderberg also finds that women, when they do negotiate, get less out of it. So we have this, large set of studies that point to women not doing so well in the negotiation. And we've been doing a lot to try to improve that. We train women to negotiate. There is a big push now to train 1 million women in the US to become better negotiators. We set up a lot of things to try to get around these issues. And what I'm going to argue is that if we have underlying differences in task allocations, then that's going to spill in to your ability to negotiate. So while I can condition on the particular job you have, if I don't control for the underlying task assignments you have, it's going to look as if you're a poor negotiator when in fact it's driven by the underlying task allocation. So what we did, this is a study with Rania Gihleb and Rachel Landsman. Rania is at Pitt and Rachel is a former student of ours. What we wanted to do was just to say, okay, the problem with looking in the field is I don't know how the task assignment came about. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to say, I'm randomly going to give people a task that is either very productive or not so productive, so that I sort of get a lower bound for what can the task assignment itself do. So here's precisely what we did. So we have, we set up sort of triads with one manager, 2 workers, where one worker is given, so this is back in the lab, obviously, one worker is given this slider task where you have to put the slider at a specific point in order to perform the task. So one worker is getting the slider task, another worker is instead given this key press task. And the key press task is about 3 times more productive than the slider task. So, to no fault of their own, they're going to be stuck in sort of either a very productive task or a less productive task. So you could think about it, imagine if you have a book representative who's either given the job of selling books in Ames, Iowa, which is a very small college town, or in Cambridge, where there are lots of universities. Now, of course, the book seller in Cambridge is going to sell lots of books, but to what extent is that coming from the bookseller, him or herself, or the task that we gave them? Okay, so we're gonna give these workers 2 different tasks. We're gonna look at the compensation that they get for their performance on these tasks and the ability they have to negotiate and improve their compensation given those tasks. So this is the setup. We have one manager, he's the guy who's colored black, and then I have a green and a blue worker. The green worker is working on the demanding task. It's much slower than the blue worker who has been given this key press task that is about 3 times as productive. So they're both going to produce an output. They're gonna give that output to the manager. The manager gets a share of the output, and the remainder he has to distribute between the 2 workers. So he doesn't get to decide how much to distribute, but he gets to decide how to distribute it. And given that the manager is benefiting from the total output, of course, he wants to make sure that his workers are happy. So he's going to try to set a wage that increases the overall production. Okay, so that's the setting we have in mind. So you can see how the typing task is meant to capture the highly promotable task and the slider task, the less promotable task. And once he gets the output, he gives it back to the workers. So they're doing this for 5 rounds in a fixed group, and they have before each payment round, they perform the task for 2 minutes. And then for every task that they solve, independent of it being the slider or the key press, the joint surplus that they get is 5 cents per problem, and the manager gets 2.5 cents per problem. So that's the setup. I wish I could ask if there are any uncertainties in the design, but I presume that Juan Camilo is going to look at me sternly if there are any issues on the design. Okay, good. He's not looking at me sternly. So this is the screen that the manager gets. He gets like a brief CV from the green worker and the blue worker. And then they're told, as you can see here, the green worker solved 22 problems. The blue worker solved 82. This is your total payment that you can distribute the payment between the two. You have a total of $5.20. And by moving this slider, you can decide how much do you want the green worker and how much do you want the blue worker to get. So that's the setup, okay? So let's see what happened. We look at this both when there's no negotiation, just to see how much would you pay the worker if there was no negotiation, and also what happens when we allow for there to be negotiation. And the way the negotiation works is the workers perform the task, they pay 5 cents if they want to talk to the manager, and then they can just say whatever they want, okay? So what happens after, so remember they're stuck doing these tasks. As I said before, performance is much, much higher if you're on the productive task. You have the high revenue generating client, you're producing lots of output, but they're working for the exact same time. And remember, they're randomly assigned to these tasks. Now, the question is, what kind of compensation are we going to see? So they're working on these separate tasks. And what we see is that the compensation is certainly more compressed. You're not just getting what you're producing, but there's still a big advantage to being given the more productive task. Okay, so we end up seeing a wage gap of about 25% in terms of the overall compensation. So if you're given the productive task, you end up taking more money home. Now, what is driving that difference, as you might expect, is the productivity differences. So if we just run a simple regression and say, what is the disadvantage that is given to the worker given the less productive task? It's about $1. But it is almost entirely explained by the differences in productivity. So just for the task that you're given, we get this difference in compensation, right? So now we could say, well, how does that interact how does this task allocation interact with your ability to negotiate? Okay, so as I said before, the chat basically just allows you to pay 5 cents to talk to the manager for 3 minutes to sort of say, this is why I want the pay that I want. And then after that, the manager gets to set the wage, okay? And this really does not affect output very much. Both the key press and the slider worker keeps producing. If anything, the slider worker, the less productive worker, is a little bit less productive. What happens to overall compensation when we allow for negotiation? We now see a wage gap of about 31%. Okay, so we get a larger wage gap. And where is that larger wage gap coming from? So remember, before we had a 25 percentage point wage gap. Now we get 31% overall. And where it's coming from is not from them differing in their willingness to negotiate, because both the slider worker and the typing worker goes into negotiate. But where it's coming from, so you can see, if I solve on a letter pair as the typing worker, I get about $3.5 cents, and the slider worker gets 1.5 cents. So I benefit from the other person's high productivity. So the manager is sort of trying to make things a little bit more equal. But you can see what happens on the negotiation treatment is that I'm taking for every round about 25 cents from the slider worker and giving it to the typing worker relative to when I didn't have negotiation. And the cause of that is that this ability to go in and negotiate only helps out the worker who's on the productive task. So the only person who's going to benefit from going into the negotiation is the person who's given the more promotable task. So if we look at controlling for negotiation, we can see that the action of going in to negotiate improves your salary with about 1/4 in each round. Now, the slider worker who is given the non-promotable task has no advantage from negotiation. they don't benefit from going in and saying to the manager, I'm stuck in this task, there's nothing I can do, I'm working as hard as I can. So we're seeing this negotiation. If you imagine the women are more likely to be the slider worker, you can see why they might not be as eager to negotiate, because they don't benefit from the negotiation, okay? So the person on the less productive task is going to come out with a smaller gain, okay? Now, of course, we could say, well, why is this happening? Well, of course, they're saying different things when they go into the negotiation. Like, so the types of things that you can say in the negotiation to the manager depends on the task that you've been given. So, just to give you a sense, they come in with different expectations for what they should be getting out of this. The slider worker thinks that key press is much easier. The key press worker thinks that the key press is harder than what it is. So there's this conflict in what they think they should be getting out of this, as you might imagine. But so they sort of have this self-serving perception before going into the negotiation. Now, in order to figure out what's driving these differences, what we did was that we asked some undergraduates to code the chat, and we asked them to code it into a number of different categories. And it turns out that they really get into the environment that they're in. So this is just examples of the chats that we see. Oh, sorry. This first worker is probably the most entertaining that we have. He says, sir, I need this. My family needs this. I'm about to send my kids out as bedsheet ghosts for the 5th straight Halloween. My wife is on the verge of leaving me. Through all of this, I still come in, put my head down, and get my work done. Am I a blue worker, meaning the very productive worker? No, but I think I'm one of the best green workers we have here. So they're clearly, he's trying to plead to the manager, come on, I'm stuck doing this horrific slider task, just like you would if you were selling books in Ames, Iowa. There's not much you can do. There's one university you can reach, right? There are other ways of talking. There are others that just point out how hard it is to be working on the less productive task. When it comes to payment distribution, I believe you should take into account that my task is much more difficult than the blue workers. And of course, then there's the kind of chat that you can really only have if you are a blue worker who's been given the very productive task. And this is where negotiation comes in, because if you are given the very productive task, what it allows you to do is to threaten the firm in the future. So if you are given the client that brings in lots of revenue, and if you threaten to cut down production, that's very dangerous for the manager. So here's one example of a chat where a blue worker, the productive worker, says, the green worker isn't pulling in the kind of money I want. I want 75%, so we'll make the green worker work harder. It would be better for all of us. And the manager says, but the green worker's task is much more time consuming and harder. And the blue worker says, so you want my income? If you can't make as much money, that's not our problem. And the manager says, if you want more profit, then you have to work harder. And the blue worker says, give me 75% of what we're doing, or I'm not going to work next turn. And we'll all suffer. Do we all have a deal now? So, obviously this is an extreme case, but you can see how the workers who are given the more promotable task hold a significant bargaining advantage, because it is very, very costly if that worker begins to cut production. And indeed, when we classify the chats, people talk exactly the way that we would expect them to do. If you are a typing worker, you talk about your amazing output. If you are a slider worker, you talk about how hard it is for you to work. And as you can imagine, only the typing worker can be aggressive in these chats. And indeed, that helps explain part of the reason why you benefit from the chat when you have the more productive tasks. So if we control for the chat, you can see that threatening is highly productive. If you threaten, you get more pay. If you instead go into the negotiation and say, oh, I feel bad for the green worker, that will for sure decrease your pay. But it's important to also note that it doesn't matter what the slider worker says. The slider worker cannot improve his pay, okay? And even when we control for the chat, I have all the chats in here, I'm just showing the ones that are significant, but it's still the case, even when I control for what they say, it's just the fact that the typing worker carries a bargaining advantage in this setting. Okay, so so you can see how there's this interaction between the task that you're given and your ability to negotiate. So there's sort of this double penalty to having less promotable work. You're going to get paid less, and it's going to be harder for you to negotiate. And where that sort of plays in a little bit is when we set up all these workshops to push women to go in to negotiate more. It may not be a good idea for them to negotiate more if the reason why they're not negotiating is that they're given the less promotable work. And that's sort of, Juan Camilo mentioned this before, it ties in with this paper I have with Christine Exley and Muriel Needley, where we said, there's the standard finding in the literature where we see women not negotiating very much, but those who do negotiate benefit from doing so. So what we wanted to do in this paper was just to say, what would happen if we first looked at the outcomes that women get when they choose to negotiate, and then secondly, looked at the outcomes that would happen if we forced everybody to negotiate. So if we pushed everybody to lean in. So we sort of have this assumption that women, if they just asked a little bit more, they would be better off. So due to time, I'm gonna go a little bit faster here. So this is the outcome that we get when we just say women are choosing to go into a negotiation. So you can see that most of the people who go into a negotiation gain, they benefit from going into a negotiation. About 34% of women don't go into a negotiation, but those who go into a negotiation benefit. What we did in the experiment was to say, okay, instead of letting them choose, we're gonna force them into a negotiation. Now, our sort of lean-in argument that is coming from Sheryl Sandberg and others would say, look at all the amazing gains you get from negotiating. We should just push these 34% in and they could get these incredible gains. It turns out that women in our study pretty much have optimal entry. If we force them to always negotiate, there are no additional gains to be had. And all we're achieving by pushing them into the negotiation is that they end up being hurt by doing so. So it's not to say, that there aren't things that we can do in terms of negotiation, but if we have this structural difference in the task that people are holding, we should be reluctant to just have sort of a one-shape-fits-all. And more importantly, as economists, we should certainly take into account what is the counterfactual. The fact that we see, we're specialists in selection, right? And what we're seeing is that there are some people who are selecting out of negotiation, and we're assuming that if they just had opted into negotiation, they would benefit from doing so. And we can see that that's clearly not the case. Just as an aside, we can also look at gender differences, not just assuming that women are on the less promotable task. Unfortunately, it turns out that when we look at gender differences, number one, we replicate the standard finding. So the women in our sample negotiate less. Part of the reason why they might negotiate less, that it turns out that when I control for gender, only men benefit from the negotiation. It turns out that it's not, even if I put women on the highly promotable task, they're still gonna, they're not gonna benefit from the negotiation, probably because they're less threatening in the environment. The likelihood that they will cut production is less. So just to sort of summarize, and then I'll just very quickly talk about policy implications. What we're finding is that these task allocations differ between men and women. There are some behavioral differences that seem to lead to these differences. And very unfortunately so, these differences in task allocations seem to interact with the pay that you're going to get and clearly interact with your ability to negotiate your pay. So there's, if we don't fix this underlying structural problem in the tasks that men and women are doing, it's going to be hard to fix the differences in compensation and ability to negotiate because we're negotiating off of different points. Now, everything I've said has sort of been in terms of, women are coming out with lower compensation and less ability to negotiate. The reason why this is an important topic is that it doesn't just affect the women. From the corporate perspective, they should be very concerned if they end up giving the less promotable work to all the women. If I hire a bunch of female and male MBAs when they first graduate, I should make sure that I identify the talent from the very beginning so that I can advance the ones who are the best. But if I put women into a position where they end up organizing holiday parties and doing less attractive clients, I'm never going to be able to see what they can actually do. And I could end up advancing the men who are not the highest ability. Now, every time we talk about interventions in firms, everybody's like, yeah, but these are hard things to change. Now, the benefit of this is that it's not very hard to change the allocation of non-promotable tasks because they're non-promotable. They're tasks most of us can do. The skills to do a non-promotable task is not a rare skill. So there are many ways that we could improve the allocation. And one of the things that we could do is just, instead of asking for volunteers, if we know that women are more likely to raise their hands, we should just randomly assign the task. We could just take turns. Another thing that we could do is just start talking about who's doing what, and is this the optimal, is this the allocation that we want? What we're seeing in the firms that we're talking to is they haven't thought about promotability of tasks. And once you present them with the data, they change the way that they're allocating tasks. So this is not intentional. It's not something that they want women to be stuck doing less promotable work. It's just that they haven't paid attention to it. So certainly changing the way we allocate the work, mentoring and training is going to be critical. When I talk about sort of introducing random assignments, it's like, how do you do that? Well, here's a picture of our dean at one of our recent promotion and tenure meetings. Takes a big technological innovation of a hat and putting names in it instead of asking for volunteers. Okay, so it does not take a genius, even though it took many years to get this to happen. When I talk about awareness, it's just that we start paying attention to this. This is a picture that appeared in the New York Times. The lady on the one lady in the picture that you can see is Kirsten Nielsen, who was the Homeland Security Secretary. This was a meeting where they were discussing the border wall. Not that that is an attractive thing to be discussing, but she's walking out of there. She's the single most important person at that meeting. And what is she carrying in her hand? The coffee from the meeting. Okay, so it's just, she should not be the one carrying the coffee. So it's just that we start paying attention to how we're doing this. And one of the reasons why I think that there is room for advancing things and why mentoring and training is going to be important is this is data that we just got from a survey where we looked at MBA's roles on a student organization, which helps them advance. We asked them whether or not they're serving in leadership roles. There's sort of top level roles, and then there are subgroup roles. As you can see, the men are the ones who are serving at the top level roles. The women are the only leadership position that they are well represented in is doing event planning. Okay, you do not get a job after business school for having done event planning. Now, where there's avenue for improvement is that we also asked them what skills they had learned in business school. Okay, so it looks like, so we have on the left is, did you learn to lead teamwork? On the left is to a very small degree, on the right is to a high degree. You can see they pretty much learned something about all the things we want them to learn. About the one thing they didn't learn anything about is the ability to accept or decline new tasks. So we need to start talking about what tasks should you be taking on to advance your career in order to improve these allocations. And in the midst of organizations changing, women should just, if they're struggling with this, form a no club. This is my no club with Linda Babcock, Lori Weingart, and Brenda Peiser. And as Juan Camilo was saying, we're writing a book that we are on the final chapters now. So we're still counting on it being forthcoming in 21. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lise, for this thorough compilation of so much work you have done in the lab and outside the lab with surveys and looking at all these possibilities of understanding the mechanisms for these gender inequalities. We have some 18 minutes for questions. I have already a few questions from our panel that I will going to share with the audience, and you should see them in the chat so that you can start reading them, Lise. And if there are questions in the Q&A button, I will give room to those right afterwards. So Raquel earlier asked about the interesting dynamics over time in the volunteering game. If you remember this game in which you had to volunteer to, at the very last moment, click the button and save the bell, or everyone's payoffs go down. And she's asking about these dynamics, and if women and men become less willing to click over time, are they in the same team the 10 rounds? This is probably a clarification of the design. And if maybe women become less willing to take one for the team when they see that there are others that aren't doing the same. So that was the first question back from that game.
In terms of them becoming less willing to take one for the team, that was the first graph that we're showing where the gender gap is stable. So it's not as if they stop volunteering. I don't know what would have happened if we kept doing it for a long time. I can imagine if we kept doing it for a long time, that things would change. But they're certainly, they end up doing it much, much more than the men in this scenario. In terms of the time that they click, it sort of very quickly converges on doing it at the end. And of course, you could sort of say, well, does this mean that maybe women are just not as good at clicking the button as men? It turns out that women also know how to click the button. And the time at which the point at which you click the button, in the mixed gender group, women are clicking slightly earlier than men, which is of course the reason why they end up clicking more. But men's decision time move up precisely in the single male session. So the decision time moves up exactly along the lines as what you would expect from it being sort of a decision that I'm going to be the one doing it. So we're not seeing a gender gap in sort of the ability to click the button.
Yeah. So we then had a question from Claudio on what efforts have been made in changing beliefs about competition and volunteering and teach women to negotiate. Are there any interventions that have been effective in shifting norms and changing these outcomes? Also, if differences are in task allocation, shouldn't we be intervening and training top managers to be more aware and neutral in terms of task assignment? And I think your last picture of the dean pulling out of a hat the assignment to committees, it's probably one of those. But if you want to extend on these issues.
So that's a really, really important question. This is not, given that it's driven, so let me take the competition part first. It's hard to figure out what to do with the competition differences. If men are more overconfident and men are more competitive, if you ask female leaders, what should women do to advance? By and large, the advice is, oh, women should be more confident and they should be more competitive. Now, it's not clear that that's the leader that we want. We've just run a very interesting experiment in the US where we had a very competitive and very overconfident leader of the country. And it's certainly this election suggests that was not the preferred leader for us. So pushing women to behave like men in that environment. If I had to select the ideal CEO for my company, it's not obvious that I want the most competitive and overconfident CEO. But I could end up selecting him if I don't have the right selection process leading up to it. So I find there are some issues that people have been trying to change the institutions around competition. It's a little harder. People talk about using single sex education to try to get around some of these issues, but there's not a clear sort of easy path forward that we can embark on quickly. Now, the less promotable task is a much, much easier issue to deal with because it is driven by beliefs. So beliefs can be perturbed. And one of the ways they can be perturbed is that we start talking about this so that you don't have the expectation that women are going to step up. But most importantly, it is up to the organization to change this. This is not something that a woman can just change by saying, oh, I'm going to try to change the beliefs. We have to make it clear to the organizations that it is not in their interest to take junior men and women into a company and assigning them different work without knowing what their underlying skill is. I've been doing some interviews with recent graduates from business schools, And it is disturbing to see how quickly women can graduate and be set on a sidetrack that will never lead to their advancement. And they don't even know that it has happened. And it's not clear to me that the manager necessarily knows what they have done. Right? So we have to, and what's exciting about this is when you talk to managers is that they are eager to change. They are eager to figure out, tell me what the tasks are that I should be paying attention to. Tell me how I can fix this problem. So in contrast to sort of the other things where we've been telling firms, you should change the way that you set wages, you should do all these things. There's not been a lot of excitement over that. When you talk about task assignment, because it is not so costly to have, you don't know what the skills are. Why not try out by giving everyone the same opportunity when they first start out? Now, it's not to say, of course, later on, we don't want everybody to have the same tasks. Once I realize that somebody is really good at a task, that's what they should be doing. They shouldn't be organizing holiday parties if they can land a huge client. But at that initial identification process, we need to make sure that everybody's given the same opportunity. And certainly make it clear to organizations where it is that they're making mistakes.
Thank you, Lisa. And then Claudio had another question, and regarding the choosing of leaders that are overconfident. Claudio can tell you stories about the president of his own country, about this overconfidence in managing, for example, the pandemic, and thinking that everybody should just go out and what the hell, this is going to be fine. And just recent declarations that are scary. Claudio had another question in the lean-in experiment, and he asked, when you force women to negotiate, wouldn't that have a chance to change the allocation of tasks in the future, like a dynamic effect of forcing them into those changes of tasks? And Daniela Puglioni had a following question with that, which is, what if the negotiation extends to the kind of tasks that women are assigned to?
Yeah, so what is interesting, the problem is that we are all expecting women to do a certain job. If we don't talk about the detrimental effects that happen from having them do that job, if they go in and say that they want to do something else, unless we change the mindset, those negotiations could very easily backfire, because we have an image of the kind of jobs that women should be doing. What is really intriguing, there's a new, it's becoming increasingly, it's becoming quite common that you can't negotiate on your first salary when you graduate. So everybody comes out, you get hired by a firm, the salary is set, end of story. What we are finding is that, yeah, the salary is fixed, the tasks are not fixed. And it turns out that many of the young men, when they started their new firms, have negotiated the tasks that they're going to get. So, there's a no negotiation policy. You can't negotiate before you go in. And yet that's perceived to just be in the domain of wages. So the men seem to be successful in going in non-committally and saying, this is the kind of task that I would want to be. This is the area I would like to be in. I want to be working in this set of clients and being successfully assigned to those clients. So, there's a lot of things that I think part of it is that another thing that we're finding in the survey is that women have much smaller networks in these schools. And admittedly, this is all preliminary work and we're going to do a lot more work on it. But it seems like they don't know that they can be negotiating the tasks that they're taking on. It seems like they don't understand. They haven't been informed of the importance of the tasks that they're doing, and they are not informed that others seem to be negotiating the task before they're going in. So part of the conversation should just be, we need to start talking about what you're doing today. We spend a lot of time saying you should be negotiating, you should get promoted, but we're not spending enough time talking about how you just saying, sure, I want to be helpful to the boss. I'll take whatever task he's giving me, that completely can side rail your career.
Yeah. Raquel had a question. I think it was during the presentation of the negotiation part, And she says one explanation is that they have less of a threat point. Another possibility is that they anticipate that they will do badly, not because they have a lower threat point, but because their boss may find it inappropriate for women to be demanding.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. And and there are two things that are, women in our experiment have the same threat point that men have. Okay, yeah. But the response to them threatening could be very different. Right? So what we're seeing in the literature on negotiation is indeed that women who go in and aggressively negotiate will experience backlash. So it's not as if women can just go in and behave like a man and say, if you don't give me this, this is the consequence. The response to that could be very different from what it is to men. So that's a very good point. And that's where fixing these underlying structural things rather than just saying women should just start behaving like men. So it's sort of have a new survey paper with Maria Ricalde, where we looked at all the initiatives that have been taking place in negotiation and the extent to which we have evidence that they're successful. And we sort of grouped them into two categories. One is fix the women, and the other one is fix the organizations. And I must say that the evidence on our ability to fix the women, there's not a lot of evidence that we will do better by trying to change the way that women are behaving, because they're working within the setting where they can't do much. It doesn't, so it really has to be up to the organization. And where it's exciting with this less promotable task is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that quickly can improve efficiency and the future success of these women.
Yeah, in fact, we're going to have one more question precisely on that, probably the last one. But we had also a question by Laura Juarez, and she says, can you talk a bit more about the different punishment that men and women get for saying no? I think it is very important to learn to say no, but do we deal with the different consequences that by gender?
So there's clear evidence that the consequences of saying no differ between men and women. And that's precisely why we can't just, in part because the expectation is that the women will say yes, right? So just going out and telling people just to say no could very easily backfire. So we have to put it on the organizations, but that being said, there are ways of saying no that come with less penalty. There are ways of saying, if you are given a non-promotable task where you can suggest that you're given a promotable one instead. So for example, one of my first committee assignments as an assistant professor was that I was asked to be on the website committee. Okay. Clearly not a promotable task, but I suggested that instead I could be on the hiring committee, where I would have influence over the colleagues that I would get in the future. So you're not really saying no, but instead looking at these task assignments as being a negotiation in part. So always being prepared. And I think what's also, so there can definitely be negative consequences to saying no. I think sometimes we're too worried about the negative consequences. So a soft no can sometimes get you quite far. Women have this weird ability to, when they decline a task, they write this very, very long explanation for why they can't do it. And by the time they're finished writing the long explanation, they're like, what the heck, I'll just do it, because they don't feel like their excuse is good enough. Men, they just say, no, I'm done. Right? So part of it has to be up to the organization, but I also think that we, with talking about these issues, can help women find it easier to say no. I spoke to one firm where what they've started to do is to train the women in the way that they respond when an unattractive client is being distributed at a meeting, where they say, don't get nervous during the waiting time when everybody's waiting for somebody to volunteer. Just look at your male colleagues and mimic their body language. They are looking at their phones, they're packing up their bag, they're putting on their jackets, they're folding up their sleeves, so that it seems like they are not engaged with the request of who's going to take on that task. So just mimic that behavior and try to be calm in that space so that somebody else can feel the pressure of having to say yes. So it's not to say that we should just go out and say no, but I do think that there is some, that's why you should read our book. So that's part of what we're trying to do in the book.
And we had one more question from Matias Cortez. He first thank you for the excellent presentation. And he asks, how might new technologies affect these patterns? Perhaps technology could automate some of these non-productive tasks or the non-promotable tasks, or make it easier to outsource these tasks. Could this be beneficial for women?
Unfortunately, the non-promotable tasks are very important to while they may not be promotable, they're very important to the organization. So coordinating things within a firm, one of the big things that we're seeing now with the big technology shock of all of us working from home is, if anything, nobody is paying any attention to what non-promotable task is going anywhere. So it would be, the non-promotable work is often the work that ties the entire organization together. It just goes unnoticed. And I don't think that the non-promotable work is going to go away. It would be lovely if it did, but I don't think organizations can function without, there's an inherent order in promotability of those tasks, and the less promotable work, which tends to be sort of the non-revenue generating work that allows everybody else to generate revenue, will always be there.
Yeah, so I think we need to wrap up because of time. It's going to be 3 p.m. So first of all, I want to thank you, Lise, for this amazing conference. It was excellent. I think we learned a lot, and I want to applaud, and people are probably applauding from their other side of their screens. But definitely an incredibly rich and cohesive and motivating presentation. I hope all department chairs and deans of all schools of economics see this. And if it is going to be recorded and posted, we should send it to all the schools of economics in Latin America at least, because this should be an incredibly valuable lessons with policy applications for academia and of course in other organizations. So thank you very much, and thank you for Lacea and the committee, Raquel, Claudio, Elena, Angela, for being here, and thank you very much, and take a good rest after this long presentation and rich presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.